7 o'clock in the morning, January the 1st, 1953. A gas station in Oak Hill, West Virginia, a coal town with one main street and nothing open on New Year's Day except the pumps. An 18-year-old college freshman named Charles Carr steps out into the cold, opens the back door of a powder blue Cadillac convertible, and touches the hand of the man stretched out under a blanket on the back seat. The hand is cold. It had been cold, as investigators would later conclude, for quite some time. The man in the back seat is Hank Williams. He is 29 years old. He is the biggest star country music has ever produced. The man who wrote Your Cheatin' Heart, Hey Good Lookin', and I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry. 10 weeks earlier, he sold 14,000 tickets to his own wedding, twice, in one day. 5 months earlier, the Grand Ole Opry, the institution he made famous, fired him. And for the last several months of his life, his personal physician was a paroled forger who bought his medical diploma through the mail for $50. A few hours before that gas station, a highway patrolman leaned into the Cadillac, looked at the man in the back seat, and told the driver, and I'm quoting the official record here, "That guy looks dead." Everyone kept driving. I'm Roman. This is Country Mysteries, and this is the last ride of Hank Williams. A story where the only thing harder than figuring out who killed the king of country music is figuring out exactly when and where he actually died. Because 70 years later, nobody can tell you for certain. Welcome to Country Mysteries. Hiram Williams was born on September 17, 1923, in Butler County, Alabama, with two things that would define his entire life: a gift and a curse. The curse came first. He was born with spina bifida occulta, a defect of the spine that meant his back hurt more or less every single day he spent on this earth. The gift arrived a few years later on a street corner in Georgiana, in the form of a black street musician named Rufus Payne. Everyone called him T-Tot, who taught the skinny kid with the bad back how to play guitar in exchange for pocket change and leftover food. Williams said later, "All the music training I ever had was from him." Nashville would spend decades polishing the legend of the Hillbilly Shakespeare. The Hillbilly Shakespeare himself was always honest about where the poetry came from. The rest of the origin story runs on pure Alabama grit. His father spent most of Hank's childhood in a veterans hospital, so his mother, Lily, ran boarding houses. And by every surviving account, ran them the way a drill sergeant runs a barracks. Hank sold peanuts, shined shoes, and sang on the sidewalk for coins. Years later, when a reporter asked him to explain what makes the hillbilly sound authentic, Hank gave the definitive answer: "You gotta have smelt a lot of mule manure before you can sing like a hillbilly." By that standard, his qualifications were impeccable. By 14, he had his own band, the Drifting Cowboys. By 15, he had his own radio slot on WSFA in Montgomery, where they billed him as the Singing Kid. By 18, he was a working honky-tonk musician with a repertoire of heartbreak songs and a reputation for not always finishing the show vertical. And in 1944, he married Audrey Shepard, a marriage best described as a 14-year custody battle over one man's liver. Audrey wanted to be a singer. Audrey was, by every charitable account, not a singer. Hank put her on stage anyway because it was easier than the alternative, and the alternative was Audrey. Then came 1949, a song called Lovesick Blues, which, in a detail I enjoy far too much, wasn't even his song. It was a 20-year-old show tune he'd picked up, went to #1, and stayed there for 4 months. On June the 11th, 1949, Hank Williams walked onto the stage of the Grand Ole Opry for the first time. The audience called him back for 6 encores. 6. The Opry had a strict no-encore tradition, and they broke it for a 25-year-old from Alabama in a white cowboy hat. For the next 3 years, he was untouchable. Cold, cold heart, hey good-lookin', jambalaya, half the American songbook, written by a man who could barely read sheet music. His creative method, as he liked to describe it, was not exactly tortured. If a song can't be written in 20 minutes, it ain't worth writing. 20 minutes. There are Nashville professionals today who spend longer than that naming a demo file. And here's your first re-hook, because this story runs on a timer. From that 6 encore night at the Opry to the cold hand in Oak Hill is 3 years, 6 months, and 3 weeks. That's the entire window. Everything you're about to hear happens inside it. The machine started breaking in 1951. The back, always the back. A fall during a hunting trip that year finished what the spina bifida had started. That November, surgeons at Vanderbilt fused his spine. It didn't work. He performed in a back brace, and the thing that made the pain bearable came in a bottle. And the thing in the bottle made him miss shows, and missing shows made the promoters furious, and the fury made him drink. Round and round. His marriage went first. Audrey filed, and on May the 29th, 1952, the divorce was final. He told friends she'd broken his heart. Then he wrote the heartbreak down and sold it, because that was the one part of the machine that never stopped working. Nashville has always had a talent for monetizing its own funerals. Then, August the 11th, 1952, the Grand Ole Opry, the church he built the congregation for, fired him for missing shows and showing up drunk. Opry manager Jim Denny reportedly hoped the firing would be a wake-up call, a temporary scare to sober him up. He'd be reinstated once he cleaned up. That was the plan, anyway. There's a famous piece of Nashville folklore about what happened at Hank's funeral 5 months later. That someone looked at the enormous crowd and said Hank would have sat up in his coffin and told the Opry he could draw more people dead than they could alive. It's probably too good to be true. Most things in this story are. Fired from the Opry, dropped by his movie studio, divorced, and in constant pain, Williams went back to Shreveport, Louisiana, to the Louisiana Hayride, the same regional radio show where he'd started. In country music terms, this is the part of the movie where the champion goes back to the gym in his hometown. Except the montage that followed wasn't a comeback. It was a countdown. Because this is where the doctor comes in. And I'm using the word doctor the way you use air quotes. Horace Raffle Toby Marshall was a convicted forger, paroled out of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in 1951. At some point after his release, he acquired a diploma declaring him a doctor of science, purchased, according to the later investigation, for around $50. It was, to be fair, a very official-looking piece of paper. Marshall attached himself to Williams in the fall of 1952 as his personal physician, and his treatment plan for a chronic alcoholic with a heart condition was a sedative called chloral hydrate. If you don't know the name, you might know the street version. Chloral hydrate mixed with alcohol is literally the recipe for knockout drops, a Mickey Finn. The thing crooks in old movies slip into a Mark's whiskey to put him on the floor. Toby Marshall was prescribing the active ingredient of a Mickey Finn on forged prescription blanks to a man whose whiskey intake was already a matter of national concern. 9 days before Hank died, Marshall wrote him a fresh prescription for 24 grains of it. And Hank paid him for this. $300 a month, which, adjusted for inflation, is roughly the dumbest money ever spent in the history of country music. Except it wasn't dumb at all, and that's the sad part. Hank Williams was in pain. The real doctors had failed to fix him. Half of Nashville had given up on him, and the man with the $50 diploma returned his calls. Con men don't find victims. They find vacancies. Meanwhile, the love life recovered, loudly. In October 1952, Hank married 19-year-old Billie Jean Jones Eschlamar. Twice legally, 3 times total. And I need you to follow the math here because it's magnificent. First, a quiet civil ceremony on October the 18th in Minden, Louisiana, done quickly, in part because they were worried Audrey would show up and stop it. That wasn't paranoia, by the way. Audrey had already flown into Shreveport that week, and the resulting fistfight left bruises you can spot on Hank's head in the wedding photos. Look closely at those pictures sometime. That's not stage lighting. Then, the next day, October the 19th, 2 more ceremonies at the Municipal Auditorium in New Orleans. Public ones, ticketed ones. A matinee wedding and an evening wedding, roughly 14,000 seats each, with programs on sale for 50 cents. Paleo 8,000 paying guests watched Hank Williams get married to the same woman twice in one day, with a towering cake at each show. The Opry had fired him 2 months earlier for being unreliable. Say what you want about the man, he showed up to all 3 of his own weddings. It's easy to laugh at the ticketed wedding. I clearly just did. But hold the image for a second, because it tells you exactly where Hank was in October 1952. Broke enough to need it, famous enough to fill it, and surrounded by people who looked at a dying man's wedding and saw a 2-show booking. Keep that in mind. Every single person in this story keeps the meter running, all the way to the end. One more scene before the finale, because it's the one that haunted everyone who witnessed it. Sometime in 1952, in a car between shows in San Diego, Minnie Pearl, the Opry's beloved comedienne and one of the few people in Nashville who never stopped being kind to him, tried to keep Hank steady the only way she knew, by getting him to sing. They sang "I Saw the Light," his own gospel anthem. Hank stopped mid-verse, turned to her, and said, she retold it for the rest of her life, "Minnie, there ain't no light. It's all dark." Remember that line. Before this video is over, a theater full of people is going to sing that exact song at an empty stage. Now, the last ride. December 1952. Hank has 2 holiday bookings, Charleston, West Virginia on New Year's Eve and Canton, Ohio on New Year's Day. Big shows, big checks, and, after a year of cancellations, big pressure to actually appear. He hires a driver, Charles Carr, 18 years old, a college freshman, the son of a Montgomery taxi company owner. An 18-year-old kid driving the most famous invalid in America across the Appalachians in the dead of winter. What could possibly go wrong? They leave Montgomery on December the 30th in the powder blue Cadillac. An ice storm swallows the route. On the 31st, they try to fly out of Knoxville to make the Charleston show. The plane takes off, circles in the fog, and lands right back in Knoxville. Charleston is canceled. The new plan? Overnight push to Canton, 600 miles through the mountains, on New Year's Eve, in the ice. That evening, they check into the Andrew Johnson Hotel in Knoxville. Hank is in bad shape, exhausted, drinking, hiccuping convulsively. A doctor is summoned to the hotel, Dr. Paul Cardwell, a real one this time, who administers 2 injections of morphine mixed with vitamin B12. Morphine. On top of the alcohol. On top of, quite possibly, the chloral hydrate from the $50 doctor, who, according to later accounts, was consulted by phone and insisted Hank get to Canton regardless of his condition. There was a show to make. The meter, remember, always runs. Around 10:30 that night, hotel porters carried Hank Williams out of the Andrew Johnson Hotel. Not helped, carried. He could not walk to his own car. They laid him on the back seat under a blanket, and Charles Carr pulled out into the night. Whether the man on that back seat was asleep, unconscious, or already dying is a question that has kept researchers busy for 70 years. The hotel staff's accounts of whether he made a sound, a cough, a hiccup, are where the whole timeline starts to dissolve. An hour later, near Blaine, Tennessee, a highway patrolman named Swan Kitts pulled the Cadillac over after a near collision. He looked in the back, and he said the sentence this entire episode hangs on. "That guy looks dead." Carr explained that Williams had been sedated by a doctor and was sleeping. The patrolman wrote a ticket for $25 and let them go. I want to be fair to the officer. It was 1952. The driver had a doctor's story, and Hank Williams looking half dead was, frankly, the man's default setting that year. But the fact remains, the last person with legal authority to stop this car looked directly at Hank Williams, said the quiet part out loud, took his $25, and waved the hearse on through. Carr drove all night, mile after mile of black ice and mountain switchbacks. And here the record goes quiet, because the only living witness was an exhausted teenager watching the road. Did Hank speak at a diner stop in Bristol? Did he move at Bluefield? Every account contradicts the next one. What we know is this. Just before dawn on January the 1st, 1953, Carr pulled into a Pure Oil station in Oak Hill, West Virginia, to ask for directions and to check on his passenger, who had been silent for a very long time. The blanket had slipped. The hand was cold and stiff. In the pre-dawn dark of a coal town gas station, an 18-year-old realized he had been driving a dead man. For how long, nobody could say. Hank Williams was pronounced dead at 7 a.m. In the car, they found empty beer cans and a scrap of paper with an unfinished lyric in Hank's handwriting, reportedly ending with the line, "The love that felt so dear fades far away." The man wrote his own epitaph and left it on the floor of the Cadillac. Even dying, he couldn't stop finishing songs, almost finishing them. The inquest was held that same day in Oak Hill by a Russian immigrant coroner's physician named Ivan Malinin, who performed the autopsy in a local funeral home, working through a language barrier, on the most famous body in America. His verdict? Insufficiency of the right ventricle of the heart. Heart failure, aggravated by acute alcoholism. Here's the detail that still makes researchers grind their teeth. No toxicology for drugs was run. No test for morphine. No test for chloral hydrate. The two chemicals injected and prescribed into Hank Williams in his final hours were never looked for. And the men who provided them were never charged with anything at all. The file was closed by lunchtime in a town Hank Williams had never once played. And that night in Canton, Ohio, the show went on. The promoter stepped out and announced to a full house that Hank Williams would not be appearing, because Hank Williams was dead. And the audience laughed. They actually laughed, because Hank no-showing a gig was a running national joke, and they assumed this was the excuse. Then the cast came out and sang "I Saw the Light" with the spotlight on an empty stage, and the laughter turned into something else entirely. I've covered a lot of dark moments on this channel. A theater full of people laughing at a man's death announcement, then realizing it's real mid-laugh. That one stays with you. 3 days later, Montgomery, Alabama held the largest gathering in its history since the Civil War era. 2,750 mourners packed the city auditorium. The crowd outside was estimated at somewhere between 15 and 25,000. And the machine, the one that never stops, hit a new gear. Hank's current single climbed to #1 within weeks. Its title, and I promise I am not making this up, was "I'll Never Get Out of This World Alive." The man's last joke, delivered from the far side of the grave with perfect timing. In this business, even the irony charts. Then came the bills. Toby Marshall, the $50 doctor, sent an invoice to the estate of the man he'd been dosing. $736.39. He then billed the widow another $800 for services rendered. Billie Jean refused to pay, and in March 1953, she sat before an Oklahoma legislative committee investigating Marshall and said, on the record, "I have never accepted the report that my husband died of a heart attack." The committee dug in. Marshall admitted under oath he wasn't a physician, and his parole was revoked. For the forgery, mind you, not for Hank. The courts, meanwhile, spent years deciding which widow was legally the widow. A judge eventually ruled the big-ticketed wedding hadn't been valid in the first place because Billie Jean's previous divorce hadn't yet been final. 28,000 paying witnesses, and the marriage still didn't hold up in court. For Hank Williams, no one was ever charged, tried, or so much as formally blamed. The only man punished in connection with the death of the king of country music went down for paperwork. So what killed Hank Williams? Pick your suspect. The heart, worn out at 29 by pain and whiskey, that's the official version. The morphine on top of the alcohol, that's the pharmacological version. The chloral hydrate from a conman with a mail-order diploma, that's the criminal version. The industry that kept booking, billing, and driving a man everyone could see was dying, that's the uncomfortable version. Or the coldest reading of all, that Hank Williams died somewhere on a dark highway in the Appalachians, at an unknown hour, in an unknown state, alone on a back seat. And the world was too busy keeping the meter running to notice the exact moment the greatest songwriter in country music stopped breathing. The patrolman said it out loud at 11 p.m. The gas station confirmed it at dawn. Somewhere in those 8 hours, on some unmarked mile of that road, country music ended and country mythology began. One last thread, because this channel pulls every thread. The 19-year-old widow, Billie Jean? 7 years later, she married another country star, Johnny Horton, the Battle of New Orleans singer. In November 1960, Johnny Horton died too, killed by a drunk driver. A death he had, by multiple accounts, spent months predicting in unnervingly specific detail. One woman, two country legends, two premonition-soaked deaths 7 years apart. If that sounds like a story that deserves its own episode, it's coming on this channel very soon. Next time, though, a man who survived everything Hank didn't. The bottle, the bankruptcies, 4 wives, a face-first car crash, and became a national punchline in the process. They called him No-Show Jones. His wife once hid the keys to every car on the property so he couldn't drive to the liquor store. So George Jones took the riding lawnmower, 8 miles, to the bar. The savage, hilarious, and genuinely heartbreaking war of George Jones and Tammy Wynette. That's the next episode of Country Mysteries. I'm Roman. Thanks for riding along. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what killed Hank Williams? The heart? The morphine? The knockout drops? Or the meter that never stopped running? I read every answer. Don't take the night drive. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.